Wyoming Territory. December 1881. The high plains stretched in every direction like a gray iron sheet, broken only by ridgelines of bare rock and the occasional dark smear of pine along a frozen creek. Temperatures had already dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius by mid-November, and the settlers scattered across this country knew what was coming. They had seen it before, or heard about it from those who had. The kind of winter that didn't warn you twice. Nobody paid much attention to the woman, living alone near the rock hollow at the foot of Laramie Ridge. There was nothing remarkable about her situation on the surface. A widow, a broken-down Conestoga wagon, a patch of ground too rocky to plow and too exposed to be worth much. Most people who passed that way gave her a glance, maybe a nod, and kept moving. She wasn't building what anyone would call a proper homestead. She wasn't building anything that made sense, for that matter. But by the time the worst blizzard of that decade finished tearing through Wyoming Territory, her shelter was still standing. Her fire was still burning. And the neighbors who had quietly pitied her were asking, some of them for the first time in years, whether they had been doing it wrong all along. If you ever wonder what people with almost nothing actually understood about surviving cold, stay right here. Subscribe and hit the bell, because every week we bring you a real technique from the frontier that worked when life depended on it. Drop a comment and tell us, where are you watching from? Her name, according to local homestead records from Laramie County, was recorded simply as E. Morrow Widow. She had arrived in the territory in the spring of 1880 with her husband, 2 oxen, and a Conestoga wagon loaded with the tools of a family that planned to build something permanent. By late summer of 1881, the oxen were gone, traded for flour and salt, and her husband had died of a fever that swept through the settlement near Horse Creek. She was left with a wagon, a cast-iron cook stove small enough to carry under one arm, and about 3 weeks before the first hard frost. The land she occupied wasn't ideal. It sat at roughly 6,800 feet, about 2,070 meters, in elevation, on the western slope of a ridge that funneled wine down from the north like a chimney running in reverse. The nearest timber stand was over 4 miles away. There was no stone foundation laid, no walls framed, no roof cut. What she did have was a natural hollow in the rock face, a shallow concavity in the sandstone, maybe 14 feet, 4.3 meters, wide and 8 feet, 2.4 meters, deep, carved by water and wind over centuries. It wasn't a cave. It was barely a recess. But it faced southeast, away from the prevailing north wind, and the rock walls on either side rose nearly 9 feet, 2.7 meters, before they opened to the sky. Most people in her situation would have tried to join another family before winter closed in. Oral accounts from the Horse Creek settlement suggest she was invited more than once. She declined each time. She had a different idea, though at the time she probably wouldn't have called it that. She was just looking at what she had and figuring out what it could do. What she saw in that broken wagon and that hollow in the rock was not a ruin. It was a raw material to shelter that, when winter finally arrived, would outperform nearly every conventional cabin within 20 miles. The construction, if you could call it that, took about 11 days. She began by driving the wagon, still on its wheels and axles, straight into the rock hollow until the rear of the wagon box sat flush against the sandstone face. The wagon frame, made of white oak and still structurally sound despite the cracked canvas, now formed 3 walls of room, 2 sides and front. The rock face formed the 4th wall and the back. She had, in effect, created a box inside a box, the wagon's interior volume nested against a solid geological mass. The canvas covering the wagon was still largely intact. She doubled it over the front opening, layering it with dried grass she had cut and bundled to the fall, then plastered the whole surface with a thick coat of riverbed clay mixed with ash, a technique that, oral accounts suggest, she may have observed among Arapaho women who had wintered in the area. The clay-ash mixture, when dried, formed a shell roughly 2 to 3 inches, 5/8 centimeters, thick, that was nearly windproof and significantly reduced moisture penetration. Here is what makes this technically interesting. The sandstone rock face behind the wagon was not just a wall. It was a thermal battery. Sandstone has a relatively high heat capacity. It absorbs and stores warmth slowly and releases it even more slowly. When Morrow lit her small cook stove inside the wagon, the radiant heat from the firebox traveled outward in all directions. The rock face, just 3 to 4 feet, about 1 meter, behind the stove, absorbed that heat continuously during the hours the fire burned. Once the fire died down or went out entirely, the rock began to release that stored warmth back into the enclosed space. Slowly, steadily, over the course of 6 to 8 hours. The ground beneath the wagon was not bare. She had covered it with several inches of dry grass, then overlaid that with the heaviest canvas sections she could cut from the wagon cover. This insulating layer separated the living surface from the frozen earth, which in a Wyoming winter at that elevation could reach temperatures well below 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius just a few inches down. Cold floors are one of the most overlooked sources of heat loss in frontier shelters, and she had addressed it without any formal knowledge of thermodynamics, simply by instinct and observation. The cook stove vented through a gap she had chiseled and widened between 2 sections of the rock face, a natural crack in the sandstone that ran roughly vertical for about 4 feet, 1.2 meters. She sealed around the stovepipe with more clay. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't straight. A passing builder might have winced at it, but it drew smoke upward and outward, and it kept the interior clear. The whole structure, from the outside, looked like a wagon someone had pushed into a crack in the rock and then covered with mud and grass, which is, more or less, exactly what it was. Word traveled the way it always does in sparse country, slowly but completely. By early December, a few families from the Horse Creek settlement had ridden past the hollow on their way to the supply depot at Cheyenne. They slowed their horses. They looked. They moved on. A woman from a nearby homestead, who had offered E. Morrow shelter early that fall, later recalled in a letter to her sister, a letter preserved in a county historical archive, that she had felt a kind of helpless embarrassment looking at the structure. It looked, she wrote, like something a child might build for what was left after a fire. The supply trader who ran the route between Cheyenne and the northern settlements stopped by in mid-December to check on her. His assessment was more direct. According to the same county records, he told a group of men at the Cheyenne depot that the widow up at the Rock Hollow had plugged a broke wagon into the hillside like a cork in a bottle, and that he gave her until January before she'd be asking to bunk with someone else. He was not unkind about it, just certain. One of the men in that group was a carpenter who had been working in the territory for nearly a decade. He had built a number of the conventional homestead cabins in the area, squared log walls, stone and mortar hearths, proper shake roofs. When someone asked him what he thought of the widow's structure, he reportedly said, "A rock doesn't heat a room. Fire heats a room. She's got too little of one and too much of the other." It was a confident statement. It was also, as the next 6 weeks would demonstrate, incorrect in almost every measurable way. Nobody stopped her. Nobody argued with her. They just didn't expect much. And that indifference, that quiet, comfortable certainty that she had made a mistake, is perhaps the most important detail in this story, because it meant that no one was paying close enough attention to learn anything until the storm made it impossible to ignore. The storm came in from the northwest on the night of January 14th, 1882. By morning, the wind was sustained at what local accounts described as cutting and constant, driving snow horizontally across the ridge. Temperatures dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius by the second day. Not the coldest Wyoming had ever seen, but cold enough and sustained long enough to become a genuine crisis for anyone who was not adequately sheltered. The blizzard continued for 3 full days before the wind eased. By then, snow had drifted to 5 and 6 feet, 1.5 to 1.8 m, against the north-facing walls of every conventional structure in the area. At the Horse Creek settlement, the problems began on day 1. Several families found their firewood stacks, stored outside and only loosely covered, saturated with wind-driven snow that had packed into grain of the wood overnight. Wetwood burns poorly. It produces more smoke than heat, and the smoke in those conditions had nowhere to go. At least 2 families, according to county relief records from the following week, had to abandon their hearths entirely for several hours because the smoke was backing up to the chimney flue, a phenomenon caused when outside wind pressure exceeds the upward draft inside the chimney. Others were burning through their supplies faster than they had planned, stoking fires higher to compensate for walls that leaked cold air at every seam. At the rock hollow, Morrow was doing something different. She was burning very little. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this storm is the one that changed how people in this valley thought about heat. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and don't go anywhere. On the fourth day, when the wind had finally dropped enough for travel, 2 men from a Horse Creek settlement rode out to check on her. They expected to find her in difficulty. They found her sitting beside a fire that had been burning. She told them, for less than 2 hours at morning. The interior of the wagon shelter was measured that day, imprecisely, but deliberately, by one of the men, a former surveyor named Aldous Crew, who had brought a pocket thermometer. He recorded the interior temperature at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius. Outside at that hour, the thermometer read -4 degrees Fahrenheit, -20 degrees Celsius. That is a differential of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius between inside and outside, maintained with a fire that had been burning for less than 2 hours. By comparison, the best insulated conventional log cabin at Horse Creek, a double-walled structure with a stone hearth and chink walls, had dropped to an interior temperature of 29 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius during the second night of the storm, despite keeping a fire burning continuously. Crew's notes, which were later referenced in a brief account published in a Cheyenne area newspaper, also recorded something that surprised him more than the temperature: Morrow's woodpile. After 3 days of blizzard conditions, she had consumed roughly 40% less wood than the nearest comparable household. Her logs, stored inside the hollow against the wagon's rear wall, were dry. The rock overhang above and the clay-sealed canvas had kept wind-driven snow from reaching them entirely. The rock face itself was the key factor. During the hours the stove burned, sandstone, which has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.19 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, absorbed heat from a firebox and the radiant air of the interior. When the fire was reduced to coals or allowed to die down, that stored heat in the rock continued releasing into the enclosed space. Crew noted that the rock face felt warm to the touch even 6 hours after she let the fire go low. That is not coincidence. That is thermal mass working exactly as physics intended. Slow absorption, slow release, consistent interior temperature. The carpenter's confidence that a rock doesn't heat a room had turned out to be precisely backwards. The rock was, in effect, a second stove, one that required no wood, no tending, and no maintenance. Aldous Crew talked. That was the beginning of it. He described what he had measured at the rock hollow to several men at the settlement, and then again at the supply depot. He was not an excitable man. His surviving notes suggest someone careful and precise. So when he said that the widow's structure had maintained a livable temperature through the worst 3 days of the winter on less than half the wood of a conventional cabin, people listened differently than they might have otherwise. That spring, a family named Halcott, who had been planning to build a standard log cabin near the base of the same ridge, changed their plans. They found a south-facing rock outcrop on their land and incorporated the exposed stone face into the rear wall of their structure. They did not build a wagon shelter. They had lumber. But the principle was the same: use the geological mass of the landscape as a slow-release heat reservoir, reduce the exposed wall area facing the prevailing wind, and store fuel inside the thermal envelope of the shelter. By the winter of 1883, oral accounts from the region describe at least a dozen structures in the Laramie Ridge area that use some version of the same logic: a rock face, an earth berm, or a thick stone interior wall positioned directly behind a heat source to absorb and re-radiate warmth. None of them were identical to what Morrow had built. They were adaptations, translations of a principle into different materials and different landscapes. She had never called it a system. She had never written it down or tried to teach it. She had simply looked at what the land offered and used it more completely than anyone around her thought to do. The carpenter who had dismissed the idea, the one who said rock doesn't heat a room, built a stone interior wall on the north side of his own cabin in the spring of 1883. He never mentioned the rock hollow, but the wall was there. That is how practical knowledge has always moved through a community, not as a lecture, but as a quiet revision, the kind you make when the evidence becomes too plain to argue with. There is a temptation, looking back at stories like this one, to frame them as triumphs of stubbornness or individual will. But what Morrow did at that rock hollow in the winter of 1881 was not stubborn. It was observational. She looked at a landscape that others had dismissed as unsuitable and recognized that already contained most of what a shelter needed: thermal mass in a rock, wind protection in hollow geometry, a natural vent in the stone face, a south-facing orientation that gathered what pale winter sun the territory offered. She didn't invent any of this. Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains and the Mountain West had understood for centuries that topography is not just terrain. It is insulation, windbreak, and heat storage, all in one. The Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Ute, all built their winter camps with this understanding embedded in the site selection itself. Morrow, whether she learned it directly or arrived at it through necessity, was working from the same physical reality. The lesson is not that primitive is better than modern. The lesson is that thermal physics does not change with a century. A 4,000-pound sandstone wall does not care whether it is the year 1881 or 2024. It will absorb heat at the same rate, hold it for the same hours, and release it with the same slow consistency. The difference is that today we tend to solve that problem with more fuel, more machinery, and more expense when the landscape, in many cases, has already offered solution. The wagon was not a ruin. It was a frame. The hollow was not a weakness. It was the architecture. She understood that when almost no one else did, and the blizzard proved it in 3 days. If this story made you think differently about the land you live on or the way we heat our homes, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. We read every one. Subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you next week with another technique that worked when life depended on it.